So this was painted mostly with watercolor, which sounds mildly illegal in miniature painting terms, but it works. And what surprised me isn't just that it works, it's that experimenting with watercolor actually changed how I think about painting minis in general. Not in a throw out acrylics way, more like a creative cross training way. So let me show you what clicked. Quick practical note before we get carried away. Watercolor will not stick to bare plastic. You need an acrylic primer or acrylic base coat underneath. Think of acrylic as the anchor layer. Watercolor sits on top of that. It doesn't just soak in, it just hangs out, which turns out to be really important. The first thing that shifted for me was pigment density. I started thinking about watercolor consistencies like beverages. At its thinnest, it's tea, then skim milk, whole milk, cream, and straight from the pan is like butter. This is the way I've heard it described. And here's the real shift. You don't need white to lighten the color. You need to use more water. And you don't need black to darken a color or to make it more saturated. You need more pigment. So it's not about coverage, it's about value. And many painters already understand this. We just don't always stretch one pigment as far as it can go. Watercolor forces you to. White versus black underpainting. And honestly, I don't think either is automatically right. Over black, watercolor is muted unless you can increase the pigment density or introduce opacity. But if you do, especially with metallics, it can look dramatic in a really cool way. Over white, it's bright. But watercolor doesn't want to behave like a base coat. Trying to smooth it like an acrylic can feel slightly disrespectful to the medium. However, if you're chasing glow or highlight effects, white underpainting can be beautiful. So instead of asking white or black or zenithal highlighting, I started asking, what do I want the light to do? The question is way more useful. I experimented with undertones. I laid down a warm neutral underneath multiple areas, and suddenly everything felt cohesive. Not because the colors matched, but because they shared a base. Watercolor exaggerates that relationship. It makes you notice what's underneath instead of just what's on top. And that shifted how I think about acrylic too. Watercolor doesn't give you instant boldness. You build saturation slowly, layer by layer. If you rush it, it lifts, it muddies, and it gently humbles you, which honestly I need sometimes. But less forcing, more building, less trying to cover, and more trying to deepen is how I try to think about it now. The biggest shift, I think, is that you can't hide behind coverage. You have to think in values, light versus dark, transparency versus density. Watercolor sharpens that awareness. And when I go back to acrylics now, I plan more instead of just fixing things as I go. So here's the material reality part. Because watercolor is sitting on top of that acrylic layer, it doesn't absorb. It just rests there, which is amazing for experimenting. You can wipe it off, you can reactivate it, you can soften it, but you can also smudge it. Watercolor on plastic is forgiving until you touch it again. Once I find something I love, I lock it in with a light spray of matte acrylic varnish. You don't have to wait until the end. You can seal a layer mid-process and keep going without lifting what's underneath, which makes experimenting feel safe instead of risky. I don't think watercolor replaces acrylics in miniature painting. I think it sharpens it. I think experimenting with adjacent mediums makes you better at the one you love most, not because it gives you new tricks, but because it changes how you see. And honestly, that's my favorite kind of cross-training.